Okay. Thanks for inviting me to speak. I've got Scottish grandparents, so this helps get me back to my roots. But anyway, when I talk about marriage, I'm using the old-fashioned definition of the voluntary union for life of one man and one woman to the exclusion of others. Let me just make sure I've got this the right way around. I realise that this isn't sort of legal currency anymore, but it's very important because the majority of data is actually based on this definition of marriage, and I think that the idea of homosexual marriage, this is very detrimental to the idea of marriage in that, as well as being a relationship of love and affection between two individuals, marriage is a procreative union, and this locates it in a wider social context, which is essential to the meaning and the well-being of marriage. And gay marriage doesn't have that. Gay marriage is simply, a relationship of love and affection between two individuals, and therefore I don't think of it, it doesn't as marriage in the true sense. And I think it's also very important to recognise the extent to which we live in a climate which is really hostile to the idea of marriage. It simply tries to ignore it, and I really see this in research. By the way, I will mention that 1/5 of MPs actually disagreed with the statement the life chances of children with married parents are significantly better than unmarried. 1/5 of MPs disagreed with that, despite the fact that the vast majority of MPs are actually married. But just the ways that research ignores it. So, for example, a massive Millennium Cohort study looks at family breakup and father absence and the impact on children. It doesn't actually look at whether they were married or not married. The ONS, in a study which was looking at life satisfaction and anxiety, it didn't actually look at whether people were married. It looked at whether they lived in households with one or two people. And one of the papers I was reading, all about, which was actually all about marriage and cohabitation, none of this is to suggest that two-parent families should be held up as an ideal form. So there's basically a really sort of big embarrassment and hostility towards marriage. But I think that, let me get this, have I got this the right way around? If you look at the data here, you will see, we're on the side of the angels in that I think the majority of people are very supportive of marriage. The biggest group of people think that it's a shame that marriage has become less important, and it's just a minority, so that's just 22% of people who are actually hostile to marriage there. This was similar data, but it's rather blurry, and I have to speed on. One of the bits of information which I really liked was that if you look at online dating, in fact, even people who use Tinder want to get married and, hope to get married. So there is basic support for marriage. Now, what I want to look at and focus on are some of the really big benefits, and I won't go too much into the research methods at all. Actually, I just want you to know that the people who've done the research have taken into account the fact that this is not just about selection. It's not just that healthier people get married or whatever. This is basically the benefits of marriage. So let me just, it's just pictures, but so an Office for National Statistics study, it looked at a whole range of factors to see what determined life satisfaction. And what you find in many studies, many different studies, is that the top three factors are health, marriage, and the economy. Health is still at the top, but marriage is becoming more and more important to life satisfaction. And particularly during the pandemic, it was parents, and especially married parents, who fared much better during the pandemic than other people. Married couples build more wealth than others because of economies of scale, specialization. Marital norms encourage healthy, productive behavior, such as buying a home, which increases wealth accumulation. They receive more financial gifts from grandparents, and they share household expenses. So there are a lot of, there's life satisfaction benefits, wealth creation benefits, health. The findings here have been that the health gains of marriage may be as large as giving up smoking, married people have fewer strokes and heart attacks, they recover more quickly from them, they are less likely to be caught with advanced cancer, they're more likely to survive major surgery. There was a study in the US which looked at the health of 9,333 individuals between the ages of 51 and 61, and they compared the incidence of major diseases as well as functional disability in married, cohabiting, divorced and widowed, and the never married, and they found, without exception, married people had the lowest rates of morbidity for each of the diseases, for disability, for any kind of health problem, and this remained after controlling for age, sex, race. It also has huge mental health benefits. In fact, someone calculated that, some researchers estimated that the size of the effect on mental well-being was an extra $100,000 a year. So, next time you're feeling irritated with your spouse, just remember all the benefits which their being married is bringing to you. Married women are less likely to suffer from depression, and married men are less likely to suffer from alcohol abuse. And again, there was, it's too small to see, but I'll just talk through it. There was research which looked at how people's mental health during the pandemic, and this was in the States, and they found that married individuals consistently reported better health than others, better mental health, and they looked at depression, anxiety, worry, loss of interest in life, and married individuals fared best on all of these. And another thing which, here in the UK, the organisation which does a lot of good work on marriage is the Marriage Foundation, and they found that married individuals, they were much more resilient in the face of changes and deterioration in the labour market. So marriage is great for mental health. They were less likely, if you're married, you're less likely for your spouse to get on your nerves. And all of this has very good effects on mortality. Marriage increases longevity, it has a protective effect which keeps people alive. The longer you're married, the better the effect. Divorce has a negative effect. The more divorces you go through, the sooner you'll die, sort of thing. Perhaps I shouldn't quite word it like that, but you get the general idea. Okay. Controlling for economic status and income, marriage confers a 20% advantage to women and much more to men. There's a lot of discussion, actually I'll come on to that. Among the elderly, marriage reduces the chance of Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. It also decreases the amount to which an elderly couple will use formal care. They're more likely to rely on informal care if they're married. And older men have better diets if they're married. So there we go. Yes. So now, one of the biggest groups to benefit from marriage, allegedly, I mean, this is an interesting area which could be discussed a long time, but it does have a lot of benefits for men. This is called the marriage premium. George Akerlof, he was an economist, he said, Men settle down when they get married. If they fail to get married, they fail to settle down. And the research really does strongly show that marriage has a transformative effect on men, particularly in their relationship to work. Married men, they work harder, they're more successful, they're less likely to be fired. And the evidence actually suggests that marriage increases earnings by about 25%. So there may be some selection in that, people who earn more are more likely to get married, but actually the majority of it is that marriage itself increases earnings. In this study, it says, actually there were two studies which said 25%. There was another study that looked at twins, identical twins, which is always a very sound way of doing research, and that found a quarter increase in earnings. And they have much greater accumulated wealth. So your average married 50-year-old has 3 or 4 times the assets of his single peer. All of these, of course, has great benefits on children, which I think that we all know. It benefits their health and their life expectancy. And these benefits remain even after taking account of social class and income. Babies born to married parents have the lowest rates of infant mortality, and of course they score, children born to whose parents are married will do better academically, they'll finish school, they'll go to university, get better status jobs, stay out of poverty. So all the benefits that you would expect. And the evidence on this is really, this isn't just 1 or 2 studies, this is study after study after study. I mean, the findings are really strong, and there are probably few areas where the findings are so consistent. This isn't sort of, selective, this is what the majority of the data shows. And of course, children from unmarried parents, divorce will increase the likelihood of health problems by 50%. Children in lone parents' households have increased risks of pains, headaches, stomach aches. Infant mortality is increased by 25 to 30% if the mother is cohabiting, 45 to 68% if the mother is unpartnered. And there's loads of this data. And I want to get into the depths of this, but one of the things which I think is probably quite key in understanding the trajectories for children is that marriage has it's very beneficial for mental health, or perhaps I should word it the other way round. Cohabitation or not being married does have quite detrimental effects. So you find, for example, that if you look at, this is the Marriage Foundation again, they did some research, it looked at 10,929 mothers with 14-year-old children. Those who were in intact marriages, only 20% of those 14-year-olds had mental health problems. I have to say I was quite surprised that was a low figure, but anyway, that is a low figure compared to others. So if your parents are in an intact marriage, only 20% of those 14-year-olds have mental health problems. But if they're intact cohabiting, it's 27%. If your parents are divorced, it's 32%. And if your parents were cohabiting and split up, it goes up to 38%. So the amount of mental health problems suffered is directly related to the stability of your parents' union. The Marriage Foundation, they did another very big project which was looking at 20,000 adults from the National Childhood Development Study and looking at what people's outcomes were according to whether their parents had been, married, cohabiting, or split up. And they found out that if your parents were married and stayed married, you had a 30% greater odds of gaining a degree, 50% greater odds of getting married, and 30% less chance of needing benefits. And so the effect of having married parents is the equivalent of coming from a higher social class. In fact, the effect of marriage in some areas was even bigger, because if your parents split up, even if you were from one of the higher social classes, you would have a much higher chance of ending up on benefits. So even social class could not overcome the effects of having divorced parents, whereas having married parents could overcome the disadvantages of social class. So marriage is a really key sort of linchpin in social mobility and overcoming social inequality. Now, there are many other effects of having, of family breakdown. I think homelessness was actually, there was a really high proportion of homeless people. That was one of the strongest correlations, was between homelessness and coming from a broken family. And my understanding of it is that a lot of these things, it's a sort of mental health issues, because a very high proportion of mental health problems do actually start in childhood, and this in turn affects education, it affects employment, and it leads to many of the poverty indicators. One of the questions which I think is really interesting is why if you have your married couple and you have your cohabiting couple, and your cohabiting couple are in a happy, stable relationship, they don't split up, everything looks exactly the same, and yet the disadvantages are still there. And the question is, why does that happen? People think in that situation it makes no difference if you're married or if you're cohabiting. And actually it does. And this is now, and the Marriage Foundation did some research on this, and they found indeed that the quality of relationships was lower, and that there were higher levels of instability. And I think that one of the best ways of trying to understand the difference, I was looking at data on information about divorce, and I think this was helpful in understanding the difference between marriage and cohabitation. I'll explain why. So there was a research project which looked at the impact of the introduction of no-fault divorce on marriage in the US. They found that following the introduction of no-fault divorce, marriages shortened. The length of marriage shortened, and they traced this back to it was that people started investing less in their marriage. So when marriage seemed like a really secure institution that you could rely on, people invested in their marriage from the word go. But once no-fault divorce came in, they would start, for example, they would have children later. They would, the spouse, one spouse, let's say the husband, would be less prepared to invest in the education of his wife or the training. Both the husband and wife would both maintain independent employment. They'd be less likely to rely on each other. And when they do this research, they do take all the different variables into consideration. This isn't correlation, this was causal. So what happens is that when a relationship at some level doesn't feel as secure, people invest less in it, and it's a subtle thing. And indeed, when the Marriage Foundation spoke to, they interviewed married and cohabiting couples, and they found that twice as many cohabiting couples felt that their partner was less committed to the relationship than they were. So I think that it does come back down to this issue of commitment, and this actually affected the style of arguing. So what they found was that in a cohabiting couple, there'd be much more of this tendency to, one person would fire back in an argument and say, things that were not very nice, and the other person would try and keep the peace. This would happen much more in cohabiting relationships, and it was the difference between the committed partner and the less committed partner. And this lack of commitment does actually have big implications for the stability of the union. So we find that 21% of cohabiting couples account for 51% of family breakdown. The 79% of married couples account for 48% of marriage breakdown. 24% of parents who are married before they have children will split up before the child is 16. 69% of unmarried parents will split up before the child is 16. So it really makes huge difference to family stability. And if you want to create family stability, which is key to reducing poverty and to increasing social equality, then you need to promote marriage. And I think that, you know, children pick up on this lack of commitment, and this could be what is affecting them and why there are more mental health problems where there isn't marriage. And it's probably because we have increasing cohabitation that we have one of the highest rates of family instability in Europe, although our divorce rate is actually going down, which is good news. Now, cohabiting relationships and unstable relationships are found much more among poorer people. So marriage is, as I said before, it's the linchpin through which social inequality is reproduced, that poor people are more likely to cohabit for reasons I'll go on to, and therefore their own children will have the disadvantages which come from having a sort of broken family. Now, so but I think we have to be really careful about assuming that family breakdown is produced by poverty. This is a mistake. It's not true. There are cultural factors and there are economic factors. Isabel Sawhill, she's a writer from the States, she's done very good work on this, and she says economic theory falls short as an explanation of the retreat from marriage. Sorry, that's just a graph which shows the relationship between poverty and not being married. Anyway, I'm jumping ahead of myself, sorry. Let me get back to Isabel Sawhill. So she points out that the Great Depression, which was, massively serious, did not produce an uptick in family instability. Economic shifts only accounted for a minority of the retreat from marriage. Anna Sutherland and Brad Wilcox, they argued that if you look at the ordering of temporal events, the evidence actually suggests that the retreat from marriage fuels an upsurge in economic inequality. And I'm spending time on this because if we realise that this is not just about economics, this is about culture, and I think culture is something which we actually can change. When it comes to cultural issues, we've got a lot more agency, and increasing the popularity of marriage is something that we can all do in our lives. Anyway, so then there's a whole lot of discussion. So what are the cultural... Oh, and I'll just mention, before I mention that, so you have the breakdown in marriage. And this actually accounted for, if you look at racial inequality, that is linked to the fact that there's a lot more single parenthood among black families. And also, it produces inequality between families. Among poorer people, it actually produces social inequality between genders. That's something I spoke about last year. Boys are much more affected by family breakup than girls. So you will find that this will, amongst the least educated, the boys will suffer more. They will have worse education. They're less likely to have good jobs. And this feeds back into the whole system because amongst the less well-off, the boys are doing worse. So that, in turn, pushes less marriage. Then there's a whole lot of discussion about, what are the cultural elements which contribute to the breakdown of marriage, and certainly decline in religious belief is very important. Growth of contraception and abortion is very important. My own sort of personal favourite culprit to talk about is feminism. The feminists were, they actually quite specifically, they believed that marriage, they believed that patriarchy had to be destroyed and that marriage was an agency of patriarchy and that they had to get rid of marriage. So, we have for decades lived with an ideology which has since been taken over by the LGBT ideology, but, for about 50 decades we lived with an ideology which actually believed that marriage was a destructive thing. If I was to pick the 3 feminist beliefs which I think have been most destructive of marriage, I would say one is teaching people that there's no difference between men and women. I think that has been incredibly... I think that's really undermined relationships between men and women, that women tend to think that men are exactly like they are. I think it's really important to understand our differences. Another feminist belief which I think has been destructive of marriage is the idea that men are there to oppress us when men have actually been supporting us. So, we've had generations of women growing up with a hostile view towards men, and the other one is that the workplace is more important than the home. So I think those have been influential in undermining marriage, but I want to actually focus on the economic factor, because what happened was that all this became, their hostility towards marriage was institutionalized in the benefit system, which, to explain it very briefly, treated people as, for tax purposes, it treated people as individuals. So, for example, if you're a man and a woman, if you're a husband and wife, and you're both working, you will end up together paying much less tax than a husband who is supporting his family. So he will be taxed much more. If he's earning the equivalent of the 2 incomes of the husband and wife, he will be taxed much more. I hope you kind of get what I'm trying to say. And the other, but in terms of benefits, you're treated as a family group. So as soon as you start living together, you'll actually end up getting less money. So when I was talking about marriage having economic benefits, the benefit system actually counteracts that by reducing the money that you get. Now, this has had all kinds of implications. So the consequences are that, in a sense, the state outbids husbands and partners, making it better for less well-off women to stay on their own. The state provides a financial safety net. I do also think that just as there's been a change in attitude from women in terms of becoming pregnant outside marriage, I think there has also been, if we talk about 50 years ago, men would have felt a responsibility to support someone they had got pregnant. And I think that contract has also been broken. Men do not have that same sense of, I've got her pregnant and therefore I should support her. I think there's been changing attitudes on both sides to some degree. So there's financial incentives to live apart, which is, of course, crazy for a relationship and crazy for a housing market. Here is a good sentence. If you have a bolt hole to go to, well, you can drop a bomb and go, can't you? You don't have to stay for the fallout. So the way the benefit system is set up is actually very detrimental to relationship formation and to marriage. Now, what I want to argue is that the benefit system has actually essentially disrupted the social contract between men and women, because the way I see it is that marriage is demanding of an individual. It's not just about loving and caring and cherishing the other person. You also put your whole well-being, your whole life on the line, because you have to trust that that other person is going to love and cherish and care for you in return. And it's that which makes marriage, I think that is the sort of nub of marriage, and that's why it's such a rewarding institution, because it's also a very demanding institution. It's a big risk to take, and it has massively rewarding payoffs. But what the benefit system does is that it takes that away from it. So now marriage has sort of become a relationship of, love and mutual affection between two people, which you sort of see in the idea of gay marriage, because there's not the same level of risk involved. You know, a woman knows that she's got another fallback position. You know, they both know they've got another fallback position. So the element of risk and interdependence, which demands that huge trust, has actually been taken away, I think, as soon as you start depending on the benefit system. And I think the way things are going, we're encouraged to more and more depend on benefits. Yeah, and it's quite interesting because they were looking at this research, you know, amongst some research was done talking to people about their universal credit, and it was quite extraordinary the extent to which, when the going got tough, they just split up. So, you know, when a husband got sick, the couple actually split up. They got back together afterwards, but exactly those points where actually the relationship used to become stronger, it actually falls apart. Another time, the benefit system screwed up, and the couple split up because they were arguing so much about it. So, you know, marriage is now seen as being about, you know, it's a relationship of love and affection, and when the going gets tough, off you go. So I think the meaning of marriage has changed in that fundamental way. Now, in terms of solutions, I think that we really need to, you know, find ways of encouraging our children and grandchildren, just do what you can to avoid any kind of benefits dependency, because it's going to influence your sort of outcomes. It's going to, you know, your relationship outcomes to the extent that we can. But that doesn't mean the state can't play a useful role. I mean, I think personally it would be tremendous. At the moment, the system encourages people to live separately, which uses up housing. Well, why not reward? At the moment, you are rewarded in the housing market. If you're a woman, you're rewarded by getting pregnant outside of marriage. And if you're a man, you're rewarded by going to prison. From what I can see, both things will give you more access to social housing. But actually, we should give social housing, we should reward relationship stability, and the best mark of relationship stability is marriage. So I think that that married couples should be rewarded with access to social housing. That's one of my preferred solutions. I also think, of course, the marriage allowance is something which, you know, the way, personally, I think that tax should take into consideration the number of people in the family you're supporting. So if you've got a certain number of children, if you're looking after elderly relatives, all of these should be reducing the tax you pay, because you're saving the state so much money. One thing which, I don't know how much time I've got, but one thing which I didn't dwell on is the extent to which broken relationships, 51 billion pounds, the Marriage Foundation estimated family instability is costing the state, you know. So it's well worth the state's while putting a bit of money into this. Another suggestion, this was from the Centre for Social Justice, was just targeting benefits a bit more, child benefits. Sorry, it's contradictory, but I think child benefits is a bit different. If you're going to give it to someone, maybe that can go for the poorer children perhaps, but I haven't thought that through too much. And wedding fund. I think a wedding fund would be a great idea, because I think we need to change the culture, because people think they have to have very big, expensive weddings. That in itself is a deterrent. What the evidence says is the more people you have at the wedding and the less money you spend, the longer your marriage lasts. So get that message out there. And I think that really, you know, education, teach young people. There's loads of evidence. Young people want to get married. The tragedy of it is they think they will get married. If you look at the data, a large proportion of them won't. That is tragic. But young people want to get married, and I think we should be teaching our children in schools all the benefits that go with marriage, so they build that into the way they think about their futures even more, you know. And when you know all the benefits that come from it, as I said earlier, you're going to be much nicer to your spouse, even if they're annoying, you know, because they're so fundamental to your well-being. And you know, and marriage is a democratic thing. They found out in Harry Benson from the Marriage Foundation called it the lace curtain effect. So if you've got an area where you've got a high proportion of, say, well-off people who are married, the less well-off in that area are also more likely to get married. So I think that we can, in our lives, we can nurture our own marriages, and we can nurture the marriages of those around us. And it's an area where we can actually have significant social influence, you know. So even if the state's going one way, it's a kind of, we can go another way. So yeah, I think that's everything. Thank you very much.